hosting us here at Baxter St. And thank you to all of you in the audience who came to see me. I definitely don't draw this big of a crowd, but it's so great to be here. I really appreciate all of you coming out. And Elliott, what a joy to be sitting here with you. I think I've maybe once in my life had a opportunity to sit with a former student, so this is a very exciting and proud moment. One before you, but it makes me feel proud. Okay. And I can see that you've clearly been very, very busy. I'm seeing some hints of your earlier work that I saw when you were in school and then kind of had recently graduated, but I'm also definitely seeing a kind of push into new territory, and I want to talk about that. But I kind of want to start a little bit from the beginning, and we won't spend too much time there, but I do think it's really interesting and also important for you to kind of, articulate that, and for many of the young artists, many of whom I see also graduated from our program, so thank you, shout out to Tish. But I think it's really important for people to kind of hear, what makes up the foundation, especially of a younger artist. And then kind of how you use that as a springboard to take you, in your particular case, in so many different directions with kind of very, strong, similar, cohesive threads. So just starting a little bit about, I'd love to hear you share a little bit about kind of what drew you to photography.
Okay. First, hi everyone, thank you for coming. I naturally speak kind of lowly, so don't ask me to speak up, because it won't happen. But yeah, I started making photographs like a little under 10 years ago. I grew up on Long Island in New York, and photography, I always have kind of been, odd and expressive, so I've always wanted to do something creative, and acting was actually kind of like the very first thing that I wanted to do, but then acting is kind of difficult to take in the whole process into your own hands, so that didn't stick around for too long. And then I was kind of always making photographs, but didn't realize that I could be a photographer until I met someone who told me they wanted to be a fashion photographer, and I didn't really know what that was either. But once she explained to me what a fashion photographer was, it was kind of like no looking back. Like I knew I wanted to be an artist, I wanted to be a photographer, and this is what I was going to commit to. But photography has always drawn me because of how it deals with reality, but I think in the opportunity to frame something enters it into a sublime space. And whether or not you agree with me that the photographs or that the spaces that I document like kind of exist in that sublime way, that's the impetus for me being drawn to working with the image, is that I think anything that exists in the image that you choose to privilege in that way is kind of odd or a little weird, because it's just, I don't know, you don't have to do that.
It's interesting that you also say that you document space, because obviously you document space, you document bodies in space, but interesting that you choose to kind of frame your work in that way. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know when you were coming up through the program, you and I had a lot of conversations about your work, and it was not solely, but definitely grounded in self-portraiture, right? And I know there were some practical reasons for that, especially as you were coming up, but I'd love to, because you've clearly now expanded, not that you don't turn the camera on yourself anymore, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the content, sort of the bodily contents of your photographs, right? So who do you photograph? Moving from this idea of self-portraiture, right? And then maybe talk a little bit about the settings, right? I know there's a lot of tension between the public and private, but who do you photograph?
I guess I'll start with this. I'll start with the self-portrait. So I started making self-portraits out of convenience. I commuted back and forth between Long Island and NYU, but then it was also really critical for me to be able to look at myself at that point as a like emerging person within myself, like in terms of being a queer and black body, I needed to be able to look at that. But the earlier self-portraits were very specifically about trauma and violence around those intersections and being uncomfortable with those intersections. And every time I made a photograph like that I would put out into the public, I felt nauseous. And I didn't really enjoy that experience of I guess at a certain point it began to feel performative, like maybe my body was asking me to transition from some of these traumas or to make something else with them, but I was continuing to make use of them in a, I don't know, very shameful, like derelict way. So
you're saying within
yeah, within
your
the
images.
self-portraiture, mm-hmm. Within the self-portrait images, and then I think on top of that, I was just kind of prepared to look at other people and look at other things. So naturally, the people that I kind of exist in community with, or that I exist in proximity to, were the people that I ended up making photographs of. And it was actually like a very weird like photo commission for Buck magazine, where like I sent them an email and I was like, hey, like I want to shoot something for y'all, and they responded with some very weird prompt that I ended up going along with, and that kind of helped me move out into space and to photograph other people, and start considering how I wanted narrative and identity to show up in the work. So I no longer wanted to be as, I think as didactic as I think the self-portraits were. I wanted to address ambiguity, because ambiguity allowed me to do a bunch of things, and it also allowed the viewer to have several different responses. So within the photographs, like, you know, for me, all of the work, I'm maybe jumping ahead.
Jump. Jump. And one thing I do want to point out too, because you've said that you don't work, how can I say this? You don't work on projects or sort of series, which I thought was really, you can tell I did my research. I was like, how is he talking? What is he saying now that he's out of NYU? But just that you don't work kind of with series or projects, but you really think of your work as this sort of ever unfolding or sort of flowing, cohesive, I don't know how you characterize it, which I think is really interesting, because I think, you know, in a kind of typical art context, we think of bodies of work or projects. And I'm really interested in that, because when you move from self-portraiture, and I know you were going to reference some of the images on the wall, for me I see a direct, I see a direct thread. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
So the decision to not work in a series-based way, I think, is also informed by a desire to work in an open-ended way. A series and having, like, you know, a claim and a stake in the ground that I want to put forth, that's just not me. Like, I don't speak like that. I don't move through life in that way. I kind of am a person who literally takes each day as it comes. So working with the images as their own series, I think, suffices for me, because when I like make something like this, like where the images, like where there are two images that exist within the same structure, I'm referencing the image's capacity to exist in multiple ways. So the image there on the right has existed in a previous iteration where it was the primary image, and there were two images that came out of that, and that was shown at that was in a show at We Buy Gold last spring.
And the Elliott, that's a really important point, I think. I was going to bring it up later, but we're jumping, so that's cool. That a number of the works in the show have been shown before, right? But in different iterations. So I want to come back to that, because that's an interesting kind of strand. All right, so but keep jumping. Okay. No, jump. All right, I'm jumping forward.
But yeah, so I think that kind of speaks to the multiplicity that I desire to imbue the images with, and the various lives that I want to imbue them with. And this also is where ambiguity also, sorry, I said also twice, but this is where ambiguity like really serves that purpose, because since the images kind of like, they're framed like with not many answers, it allows them to flow and be in dialogue with any number of images in any number of ways that I maybe have on my mind already, and ways that I've yet to realize. So I like that as my career stands now.
You don't need to quote career either.
Oh,
it's happening.
There we go.
Yeah. That's just note to self for all our young artists out here. We don't need to say career.
Yeah. Well,
life.
There we go. As my career like stands now, this practice allows me to reach back to images that I made in 2013, 2014, and to rework with them and not kind of limit them to any one context. Like all of the images are constantly evolving as I'm evolving with the work.
And it also forces you, I would imagine, to just continually update your perception of yourself, but also just of work that is created in a specific context, right? But then, of course, can shift, as time passes and also as you evolve, I think, as an artist. Can we go back to this issue of space?
Sure.
So you mentioned earlier, I thought it was really interesting, because body for me is so significant in so many ways in your work. I love how I grab my own body. It's like, but how you initially said, and I've heard you say this before, documents space, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the settings.
Yes.
And then we'll get into like your inspirations, because you and I have had conversations about Deena Lawson.
Right.
But I wonder if you can, because there's a really deep connection there that I really love. But can you talk about how you are thinking about your settings, how you select, if at all, your settings, the space?
So maybe I'll explain them in terms of some of the works that are in the show.
Great.
So this photograph here is called On Ice, and initially I asked this person to make this photograph just because I was attracted to the way they carry themselves in the world and how they present. But I think even more than that, I was interested in their home space from having visited and been there a few times. So this is a friend of mine, and space is probably like usually the first thing that I'm attracted to, and like how that space holds a certain kind of emotion, or how that person makes use of that space. And I kind of credit that sensibility of being very hyper aware of space and what it feels like on the body to my grandparents, who are in these two images that are on the diagonal wall. My grandparents have lived in this house in Suffolk County for a little over 30 years, and my grandmother is really meticulous in the way that she appoints the house, and most of the objects that the house is appointed with are not really of any grand value. They're like tchotchkes, little things from Kohl's or department stores. And then my grandfather is really addicted to working, and he worked as an auto mechanic and then retired, got bored of being retired, and decided to be a janitor at a nursing home. But he's like constantly adding new things to the house. Like I think just a few weeks ago when I went there, he told me that he built a whole new aspect of the shed in the backyard, and he's like 85 or something like that. But I think from having watched how they take care of their house and how the care that they offer their house is a indication of the value that they have for themselves, but also the value that they have for their family and the family that they've produced. I'm really obsessed with objects and the way that they carry experience, the way that they carry memories, and I think objects they're very special. So at the same time that I'm interested in individuals in the photograph, and each of the individuals means something to me for the most part, I'm also interested in the space, and I kind of want to make an image that equalizes the space and the person, because I think that they're part and parcel of one another.
That makes sense. I think this is one of my favorite images, and I think with regards to space, so yeah, I mean, obviously grounding him within his domestic space, but I love the glance as well, that's sort of out of the frame, that then, kind of forces the viewer to become hyper aware of his or her physicality, right? And sort of the way in which you play with sort of this distance and proximity to the image, because you're sort of looking at the image, but he's looking out of the image, kind of beyond. And I know that's something that's of interest to you, right? That sort of tension between distance and proximity, the public and the private, which in your early work, I think in school, was also kind of top of mind in terms. Yeah, it was completely, yeah. But it's still present, which is nice to see. It's nice to see that you're pushing into new territory, but it's also present. So you know what I'm going to go to next, because your work, he's had me for 4 years and he can't read my mind. I want to talk about, so you're working with another genre here. Like we're now moving off the 2D space, off the image, out of the frame, and into space. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about, what is going on here.
Okay.
Talk to me about this sculptural element that you've decided. Is this the first time you've done? Okay.
So the first time that I actually did something dimensional or sculptural in terms of the photograph was maybe it was 2012 or 2013, where I was included in a show at Smackmelon.
Oh, it's Smackmelon, that's right.
They did that show,
Yeah.
Respond, which was a response to like police brutality and violence against bodies and whatnot.
Yep.
So I ended up submitting one of my self-portraits into there, but it was a self-portrait that was specifically dealing with like the violence that I experienced as far as my sexuality was concerned. And I framed the individual photograph with t-shirts that I had stained and bloodied to kind of reference like an external violence, but also an internal conflict that was also very violent and tumultuous. So that was my very, very first show, my very first opportunity to show something public. And I think I've always been interested in utilizing every element of the process. So there's the actual framing of the image when I'm making the photograph, but then there's the framing when it has to be viewed in public, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to me to neglect that as another layer within the work. Which isn't to say that I won't do it, because clearly I have done it here. But I think that kind of, again, I'm really interested in objects, and I like the tactility of objects and the things that objects can communicate. So I'm also really fascinated by how photographs live with people. So in a lot of the photographs, there will be other images re-imaged in the photograph. And I want to kind of like bend the various ways that I've seen photographs used in public and private spaces. But for this thing,
Work of art.
This work, right? The light is usually on. It's an image printed onto a light box, but I don't think it works with the camera, so it's not on right now. But the structure for this came first. The idea for it came first. I'm currently living in New Orleans, doing a residency there. And a lot of the houses in New Orleans have very like large, ostentatious awnings, and I wanted to remake an awning that I would then house a photograph inside. So I made like 13 of these metal panels, and then I made 2 sides that came out the same distance of the panels, and it did not work to close the image in that way. So I got rid of the sides, got rid of 7 panels, and came up with this spacing, and it kind of allowed the photograph to breathe a little bit more, and it also made the structure a different thing. I don't think anyone would necessarily read awning from here, but even as I was making this, I was questioning to myself how close to an awning did I want to be. Like, did this actually need to be an awning, or could this be an object that no one would necessarily find use for, or that no one would necessarily imagine? How can this just be an object and kind of be its own thing?
So this came out of your current stay in New Orleans,
Yeah.
a lot of it, right? Just sort of
Yeah.
or at least a generation of it.
And then when I was thinking, initially when I was thinking, I guess to explain the willow branches that weave the negative space, when I was thinking about how to make this awning, I didn't want to use like a continuous piece of metal. One, because I wasn't going to be able to afford to ship that back here. And 2, I didn't want to cut holes into the metal. This design of like the gaps and then the woven parts was always there from the beginning. So I didn't want to cut holes into the metal to achieve this. So I said, okay, how am I going to do this? I'm going to make them into panels. And I said, what am I going to weave the panels with? And I said, weave. Okay, I could use yarn. And I was like, don't want to use yarn. Yarn is really thin. It might break. Or like, I don't know, it just might communicate a lightness that I'm not into. So then I said, okay, what are some other like domestic items that are woven? And wicker chairs came to my mind. So I started thinking about looking at wicker, but then also looking at willow. And to be honest, I bought the wrong material. I wanted wicker, but I bought willow. And I bought a lot of willow, and this is why.
Said like a true working artist.
So this is what we ended up getting, but I like the willow because of how thick it is, but also the process that you have to undergo and to use the willow. Willow has to be farmed for X amount of months, and I bought this from a farmer in Ohio, and he shipped it to me. But then prior to using the willow, you have to bathe it for like a week. And I didn't have like any trowels or anything like that. All of those are really expensive, so like I bought 2 big kiddie pools and filled them with water and was constantly bathing them every day. And that process, process of like really taking care of these twigs, like, you know, it's a little meaningless in to some extent, but I really enjoy taking care of these things. And
I don't think it's meaningless at all. I mean, it kind of expands the meaning of the work, right? To understand the process and the thinking that goes behind. And to me, and maybe I'm going out on a twig, but Elliott knows me to be somewhat of a corny professor too. So I'm very hardcore. I know some of my students in the audience will probably attest, but I have corny jokes. But that, you know, that there's a lot of symbolism in that. There's a lot of symbolism in caring for something living and bathing it in, you know, I mean, that's like incredibly powerful actually, in a way,
and
the way you talk about it.
Libby mentioned that my residency takes place at a church. So the church like hosts 1 to 2 residents each year. You live alone, and one of the houses that they have to offer a resident is actually on the church compound. So there's no spiritual requirement for the residency, but and I wouldn't identify with any particular spirituality. But as I was bathing the willow in the backyard, the churchgoers and people who kind of have access to that space were like, "You baptize in sticks?"
That's the first thing that came to mind.
And I was like, "No," but I mean, it kind of feels like that. But like, they were very curious about that process and like kind of mesmerized and taken by just that act of bathing these sticks and like constantly being able to work with them. So then I do like that it is a living organism, and it continues to live even as like we're here right now. So I like that, you know, after a few years, depending on the conditions in which they're stored in, these will mutate to some extent, and they'll like kind of take on their own life. But enough about
that's a whole other conservation issue.
Right. So, but I do want to talk about the decision to place them over this photograph. So, as I mentioned, the structure came first.
I love Elliott doesn't even need me. Chapter 3.
I wanted to stay on topic. Okay. So I knew I wanted an image that kind of like, I don't know, all of my images are interior shots, so like that requirement was already fulfilled from the get-go. But I took this photograph with no intention to use it with this structure, but I knew that for this show I was going to use this photograph no matter what, because I wanted it to be all new photographs here. And I've been making very few images so far in New Orleans, and really focusing on like the build out and trusting myself to build these more structural, dimensional things. But this photograph in particular, I took it with different intention, but when I thought about it in reference to this structure, it felt like these suddenly became like foundational stakes in the ground, like what you might use to build a home of some sort, to guide walkways, to structure rooms, etc. And I like that these things, and it also like kind of leans in the way that the banister and the photograph of my grandmother is designed. So I like thinking about them as supports, ladders, totems, guides, etc. And they all are in service of this action of transition in the background. So here's a person who is lifting a couch, and they might be lifting the couch completely out of the space. They may be exchanging it for a new couch. They may be moving all together. They may actually be moving in as well. But in all of these examples, it's an action of transition, and I view these objects as guides or supports, or spiritual emphasis for this act of transition. And I think throughout the show there is kind of like a spiritual, I was going to quote again, but I'm not going to do that. There's a spiritual through line. So before you maybe throw in one more question, I'm going to just go right over here. So
wait a minute though, because I'm not, can we stay right here for a minute? Okay, stay right here just for a minute. Because I actually want to talk with you a little bit about audience. Because I think, you know, we just touched on this image, but you are definitely hyper aware of audience. And I mean that in a very general sense. And it really comes through for me in these pieces here, right? Where, I mean, going back to that proximity and distance and sort of inside, outside. And so you said once about your work, and you may feel differently now, but I'm going to quote, that you were interested in the limitations of photography, specifically in what is omitted from what is included in the image, what information is compromised, and to what effect in the distance or space between the image and the viewer, right? And in all of this, you're still able to kind of elicit a range of responses. But how much do you think about it? It's always a funny question, I feel like, for artists. You know, I just make the work, I put it out there, and then you lose control of it. But how much of that, because you are very conscious of space, and I'm definitely like a space curator, I think very, like in collaboration with artists, thinking a lot about space and the rhythm of how people move through shows, how they engage with work, how long they stop at a piece and then move on to the other. How much of sort of audience and sort of asking of your viewer is top of mind for you?
So
not that you're making the work for that, but you ask something of your viewers.
I think when you work as a photographer, and specifically when you work with reality, you're asked questions that no other artist or no other medium is asked. So painters, when they're dealing with representation or when they're dealing with figurative space, they're not asked, like, what's going on here? Like, who is this? Is this person real? Like, can you tell me, like, all about this person's life, what they have for breakfast and what they stand for? Like, I don't, and I think a lot of photographers do operate in that way where they want to answer those questions, and I think that's okay. But in noticing the kind of demands that are placed on photography, especially when you're working with identity.
That you can put in quotes.
Right.
Identity.
Right. When you're working with with identity, there are certain asks of these figures. So all of these people being Black people, the majority of them being queer, there's a certain kind of narrative that's expected of how these photographs will operate in the world, and it's boring. And I don't necessarily want to. Actually, not necessarily. I don't want to pander to that narrative. So in thinking about space, specifically the viewer's space that they share with the photograph, I'm interested in depicting an intimacy, and I'm interested in making something visible, but visibility is not my primary objective. I'm more so interested in understanding how privacy and how staying in your own lane can be used like as a tool for power. And I think
in an incredibly public world, right? I mean, very forward-facing.
Yeah. So now, I mean, my mind is like kind of going all over the place now, but I kind of want to
right here.
think about the title of the show.
Okay.
Because it relates to the question.
Okay, that was my last question, but we're jumping, go right ahead. And then I want to take you back, actually, though, can we stop for a minute?
Where we going?
No, let's talk about some of your influences, because I think, you know, I do studio visits regularly. Haven't been so good about them as of late, but I try, and that's always, especially with younger artists. I don't know about the word emerging, younger, not even with age, but just younger as in coming into, you know, this sort of creation space. Because you say emerging, then it's like 10 years later, you're still emerging, or have you arrived, or where'd you go? But just thinking a little, it drives me crazy. But thinking a little bit about, I totally lost my train of thought, influences. It's an important question, I think. I mean, we all, you know, move through the world and absorb through our eyes, ears, bodies, you know, whatever it is, different flavors, so to speak, right? And I'd love to hear, because I know you have a lot, I mean, I see you at openings, you're constantly, and this is one thing I always tell, especially younger artists, see work, go out and see as much work as you possibly can. I know when you get into your little zone, sometimes it's good to stay there, but when you come out, see as much work as you can. And you do that, and you have very, you know, kind of particular artists that you've been drawn to, whose careers you've sort of watched, you know, whose books, early books you have, and more recent books. So could you talk a little bit about?
Yeah. So the artist that I wanted to bring up in relationship to thinking about how the body helps you navigate these photographs, how your individual body helps you understand what the photograph is doing. Liz Johnson Artur, she's a photographer based in London. She has made photographs kind of all over the world of black people in the diaspora kind of doing shit. So like, I find that looking at her interest through her photographs, that she really wants to, she herself wants to be in the spaces that she makes photographs of. And I think that translates to the viewer of also giving them a seat at these, within these photographs. There's literally a photograph that she's made of several young women at a table. It's a yellow table, and she's like at the opposite end of the table, but the table kind of cuts off before the photograph, or cuts off within the photograph. And, you know, again, that's a gesture of folding the viewer into the experience of the work. But for me, I'm interested in distance, and I think that a lot can be achieved through distance. And because I'm not, because I don't want to parade these people's identities and, you know, whatever flag they might pick up in the world, and how they might advocate for that flag. I find that distance is really, that distance ends up being really important as a way to communicate to the viewer that yes, you have been led into this space, this is a welcoming space, but at the same time you should maintain a respectful distance to this space.
I think a lot of that too is achieved in your images, and it reminds me of some of your comments around Deena Lawson's work, right, where you know, essentially sort of said that she really kind of redefines in a way what it means to sit before the camera, right? So there's no, you know, it's very hard to kind of look, is everyone familiar with Deena's work? Kind of look at her work, I mean, even from her early work, and sort of identify tropes, right? Like the odalisque, or like in recline, or, you know, three-quarter profile, or she's really sort of redefined that in a way, and I think that's something that I see a bit in your work as well. That, you know, so where the pose and the way in which the individual is sort of positioned may or may not be familiar, right? Whereas when you see some of those sort of, and it really, I think also a lot, like even in painting, you think, right, the genre of painting and sort of the way in which bodies are posed, it's sort of immediately identifiable, and it becomes this very quick point of entry. Does that make sense? Where, you know, a lot of what's going on in your images doesn't allow that. There's a bit of refusal, right? It doesn't allow that right away.
Yeah, I think Deena Lawson is totally someone, while I was in undergrad, that changed the way that I understood images completely. When I sat her next to someone like Kehinde Wiley, who was working in painting, or Willow Awning, who was also working in photography, I found that she was using gestures that that at least seemed specific to the environment in which they came from. So she wanted to offer these people a dignity, but it wasn't a dignity that was based on mining Renaissance and like body language that is traditionally associated with leisure, luxury, and regality. So she was still offering these, offering the people in the photographs those same things, but incorporating their space and thinking about how their space impacts their how they present themselves. So that that really again changed the way that I make images.
Do you want to touch on your? Let me just see. How's my timekeeper up here?
7:42.
7:42. Okay. Thank you. Do you want to touch maybe a bit on the title, and then I'd love to open it up to all of you for questions.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
So the title of the show is A Simple Song, and I got the title from listening to a Billy Preston song called I Wrote a Simple Song from the same album. From an album of the same title. And in the song, he kind of describes having written a song that was intended essentially for a lover, and that he used very simple words, harmonies, and arrangements to communicate potently to this one individual that the song was intended for. but because he's a recording artist, his label is desiring a certain kind of return from the song being out in the public. So they embellish the song so that it can succeed within the market and, you know, be more profitable. But it's within that gesture of privacy and making an intimate act public or making a private act public that I make all of my images, and that I think this show certainly operates in. So this image here of the person's head with their earring, that the person who that image is of, they came to the show, and if you come to my coffee talks, you've heard this story a bunch of times, but I'm gonna tell it again. So they came to the show and they saw the image there, and they were like, oh. First, they almost didn't recognize that it was them, and two, when they did finally recognize that it was them, they were like, wow, like I feel so simultaneously seen and unseen. And that is really what I'm trying to achieve in each of the photographs that I make of other people, because there's no prize in visibility. I think to some extent it works, and within certain contexts, visibility is very important. But I think for me, privacy and the ownership of your body and the ownership of your narrative is even more important, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with visibility. Because so much of what we think does not end up being communicated or made tangible for an audience.
Right. And visibility is a two-way street.
Right.
I mean, you can have an image, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can be in an image or be pictured in an image. It doesn't necessarily mean you're visible.
Right. Exactly. Right. So I really am like moved by images of people at rest or images of people in contemplation, because it means that I also don't have access to something that they are that's in the space but not quite in the space. It doesn't really show up, it doesn't talk to me, it's not making itself fully visible. And I think that acknowledgement of really just being grounded within my own body and allowing that space for another person to be grounded in their own body is really important for me as a human. And I think for other humans, if other humans did that and did not necessarily claw after another person and the information that they hold, or if they didn't want to know like every last breaking thing about that individual, it would kind of allow, I don't know, I'm just gonna speak for myself. I prefer for people to navigate me with that consideration of allowing me the space so that I can also allow you the space, and we kind of come to each other where we do. I guess, I don't know, every time I talk about this, I start thinking about Beyonce at Coachella. There's one particular moment there's one particular moment in that performance where she's like at the top of the stage and the camera like swivels behind her, and like, I make these artistic gestures and I've been making them for a while, and like I believe them at this point, but there are some times where I'm like, do you really believe what you're doing? But when that camera swiveled to her back, I lost my mind, because I have no idea I'm just, what is going on in her head, like, and behind all the hair and like the body, it's just like, wow, there's just so much contained in here that I don't have access to, and here's a performer that is really laying everything out for you and like trying to make themselves appear a certain way so that they can have a successful performance.
Or she's laying something out for
Right,
you.
right, she's laying something.
And we like to think it's everything.
Right.
We like to think it's everything,
strategic
but
something.
to bring it back to your work really
I think
quickly
it's
is
so
that
great.
that the interior, I think, is some of what you are hinting at. You give glimpses, right? But there's a deep interior life that we think we know, and you're really asking us also to kind of question what we think we know, right? In a way. Can we open it up?
Sure.
Can we open it up to all of you wonderful humans? Any questions? I'll allow for one or two little pontifications. It's not really in a question. Yes.
Hey, Elliott. I'm Craig, y'all.
Hi, Craig.
I wanted to know a little bit more about the framing choice of the image in the middle. Because when you were talking about the twigs or the willow, it was like very precious material. So I wanted to just talk about like the found object and how you found it, and because you said it was a framing choice, but I feel like it's more. I feel like there's something there that I'm interested in.
Yeah. So this image, Craig is referring to this image here in the center between these, and First, I made all of that. None of it is found, but I do like that response that it is found. And I think the viewer is encouraged to think of it as found because the way of the image is organized within the object is a little haphazard. So it doesn't look as specific. It doesn't look specific necessarily to the structure. But you know, my grandmother has a lot of family photo panels. She's really big on framing photographs of us, and she's very immediate with that, and she takes a lot of pride in having us up on her walls. And I've always admired them, but then I found one of my own at Material for the Arts once, and I took the image that was inside of it and inverted it within the structure, and all of the images ended up like kind of being cropped more or less within an attempt to, or because they no longer fit any of the shapes. And I liked, I think for myself, when I wanted to do something like this, I was thinking about memory and experience and how those things exist within this kind of traditional family photo panel. So for me, when I'm experiencing something or when I'm recalling something, it's really a lot of hyper moments. So like you're hyper aware of this foot, you're hyper aware of this armpit, you're hyper aware of this negative space. But then I'm also aware that there are things that I don't have access to within when I'm recalling an experience or when I'm recalling a position. So there are elements to this photograph, specifically the one on the right, and I guess actually both of them, both of the images that make this up. There are elements to these photographs that are completely not visible to the viewer, and I think again memory operates in that way, where there are patches of memory that are just not accessible at any given moment. They may be accessible over time or at another time, but maybe not so much in the moment that you need that memory. So I wanted, and then I think again these panels are used to like organize ideal, used to organize aspiration, used to organize celebration. And within each of those organizations is a refusal to acknowledge the idiosyncrasies that make that moment up. So maybe someone had just gotten into a fight. There are several group family photos of me, of my family, where I'm actually angry in them. And maybe have just gotten into a fight with a parent or just gotten into a fight with a cousin, but like it exists there as this document that we are here with one another, and it serves that purpose of overlooking some of that aggression and discord. But I wanted to make a panel that referenced that discord. So this arrangement in particular is about, it's about any number of things, but I like that this person's gesture on the left is kind of lamenting, and then this person's gesture on the right is, for me, more adamant and more insistent in a search of something. But in any case, they're not facing one another, they're facing apart from one another, but they exist within the same structure, and yeah.
I love the reference to in those to the sort of smaller photographs that you're talking about, right, in your grandmother's house, that are really very much about memory, and these sort of cutouts that really reference those specific moments. And in the end, there's a certain also kind of sense of tactility. I mean, the photographs that we have at home are haptic objects. Those are objects that we pick up, we look at, we move, it's faded, we give, we hand, over. And I feel like I love that the way in which you framed it, it kind of has that sort of feel.
Yeah,
in a way,
and then in addition,
really nice.
You mentioned the consistency between like the wood materials.
Yeah.
And I need to maybe look into that a little bit more, but I'm curious like how wood shows up into people's homes, and how Black homes have made use of that design choice and how it's begun to be associated with certain design decisions in Black houses, but maybe not just Black houses, but American houses, I think. But wood is warm. The wood is warm, and I think I just really am. I admire brown, and I like seeing it a bunch. So yeah.
Yeah, you have another question? Oh, great.
I do, yeah. So at the risk of violating the very space that you talked about being so important around just your own personal space, I think one of the things that I'm finding really striking just about this conversation is the nuance and elegance with which you're really processing different parts of the human experience. And so I'm curious, what are either the disciplines or practices, and that can be as well defined or as loose as you might like, that help you just evolve your perception of the world, so that you're able to get in on these sorts of really beautiful nuances that could so easily go unmissed, but then also tie back into this very cohesive picture that you're developing of the world.
I'll answer that question in terms of what I'm up to in terms of myself this year. And this year, really my year started in October. So I'm 3 months into 2019 already. But responsibility was something that continuously came up, and taking responsibility for myself and how I feel within any situation, and not allowing myself to be too impacted by outside forces, and understanding what it means to be grounded in myself. Like, what does it actually mean to be rooted in me, and what does it mean to like myself, and what does it mean to also dislike myself? So it required, like, I think taking responsibility for yourself also requires a very acute awareness. So, like, what are you feeling throughout the day? How are you showing up for the things that you care for? How are you showing up for things that you want to be pursuing more? And just being honest about every last feeling that you feel. And I think that that's requires a pretty significant discipline. And I think I offer the work that, or I think I make the work within that understanding.
And also, I think being comfortable with discomfort.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, being uncomfortable is the most painful thing, I think, for so many human beings. And I think a lot of what you're talking about, and just sort of watching you over the last several years, is just sometimes just sitting in discomfort.
Yeah.
You know, and really it's those moments, I think, for you, and you see it in your work too, where you push through that, and that's where the change comes. That's where the shift comes.
And I think it's also not taking responsibility for others. So, and that includes loved ones, it especially includes strangers. But it's important to understand that everybody kind of arrives to experiences differently. So even as you're interacting with the work itself, like, you know, there are a set of visual cues in the images, but your experiences, whatever you felt that day, whatever I've said right now, and how you're interpreting that is going to help you navigate what's in this image. And that's another reason for leaving the images ambiguous and open-ended, because I am not interested in convincing anyone of anything or trying to argue someone into submission around how I would like them to understand myself, how I would like them to understand anything about the world. That will be another person's responsibility to do that. So I think, you know, just really allowing people the space to come into themselves is really helpful. And I don't think the country does a very good job at that.
And that's a lifelong process, by the way. As someone that has 2 decades on you, that's a lifelong process. But beautifully said. We had a couple more questions. Yes, this woman here, and then the burgundy scarf. Sorry, I'm barely. Me? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Elliott, I was
What's your
really, Shayla. Nice to meet you. No, but I was really taken by what you said about how there's no prize in visibility. And I was just wondering, how did you come to that realization? Like, was it through your practice, or was it through being represented in some certain way?
I think it was watching a bunch of artists who took on identity within their work, and then seeing how they privileged identity, and seeing how, you know, like, they were being kind of reactionary in how they worked with identity, like specifically wanting to, like, if we're thinking about black, and let's just leave at black, when we think about black bodies, like wanting to communicate a certain thing to white people to get them to understand something.
Right.
And then watching how, you know, the country more or less kind of understands all these things that we're already saying. Like, I spent a long time looking at the Ku Klux Klan's website, and the language that they use around self-determination is very similar to the language that black people use for self-determination, but theirs is, they are interested in violent means to achieve that. So I thought it was interesting that these two groups could be using the same language, but not arrive at the same point. Right. So and that happens over and over again. Let's say somebody like makes an image that, like, I don't know, serves to like rescue masculinity from toxicity or something along those lines.
It's a very scholarly phrase.
like, say somebody is making that kind of work, but yet we're still seeing people respond to mass. What am I trying to say? Okay, there's something about working in identity and being reactionary in that way, where it's like, okay, black man aggressive, black man wanting to counter public perception around a black man being aggressive, wanting to soften them for public perception. There's something about working in that way that still reinforces aggression that really bothers me. But that is a certain kind of visibility that will be applauded. Every news cycle, like from BuzzFeed to Vogue to any, New York Times, they will be interested in these kind of identity-based projects that debunk how everybody is already thinking. And it's like, after a few projects, and for me personally, I think, or actually my life has kind of already proved some of these things, but you would think that people would already kind of understand that point. Not everyone, I'm speaking generally. But,
I think also, Elliott, too, I think that goes back to this whole idea of becoming grounded in yourself, right? But I think also what you're talking about, so I don't begrudge any of these artists. We all evolve and go through our process of life at different speeds, at different moments, but also operating with this notion of a default culture, right? Whether it's whiteness, whether it's cisgenderedness, whether it's maleness, so that, to your point, this idea of always sort of working with this notion of identity, but kind of, and you said it earlier, in reaction to, right? As if there is a standard, right? And then we are all kind of operating as foils up against that standard. Versus Elliott, where there's, again, these sort of random points of entry, even your language around ambiguity, right? You're not giving us a starting point, or at least an expected starting point, for your work. And every piece is different, and every engagement that I have with the piece, that you have with the piece, that you have, is going to be very, very different. And we don't always have to then reference that sort of standard or sort of perceived, I call it default culture, because we always sort of like, there's all of us, and then there's like default culture. So I think that's a really good point, but I think it takes a while to kind of come to that space, right?
So what happens when you start operating from like your experience, start operating from yourself, and you're not necessarily, again, on the defense, having to respond to things that you really probably never considered in the first place. Not everything is for you. So that goes back to taking responsibility for yourself and being aware of yourself.
It's tough.
It's hard.
It's hard work. Yes. Sorry, I can't.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi, I'm Kojo. Thank you for sharing your process. And I was just wondering, do you think of the title first, or do you think of the photo first? Or do they live in separate worlds and they're like coextensive of the same idea?
So 3 things, and please hold me to these points because I don't want to go on a tangent.
I'll hold you.
Please, thank you. There are some titles that are developed by looking at a detail within the image and embellishing that detail and kind of creating a whole other photograph for that detail. So like this one is not necessarily the most indicative of it, but like it's called Help Bear My Weight, which I think is in direct response to the gesture that's taking place in the image. So that's 1. 2, there are some times where sometimes I just kind of write down my observations, like with the intention of maybe recreating that observation in the image, or just because I'm really taken by that observation and want to challenge myself to explain it in words. So in the case of this image here with the 2 stars, the title for it is, the title's back there. Somebody wants to read it out loud.
It's a long one.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, I remember it. The title is the title for it is She Threatened Most People Off the Dance Floor, Fingers Now Laced Along the Red Countertop. So obviously there's no red countertop here, and there's also no dance floor here. This is an interior, this is somebody's home. So I wrote those 2 sentences in response to a musical experience that I had in New Orleans of watching someone DJ And as soon as they got on, they changed the entire environment. Like, they kind of introduced the chaos into the space for about 15 to 20 minutes before they even pursued into like more music that you could maybe dance to. But it was like a chaos that like sat me right down into the seat, and I was like, dancing is actually not important in this moment. Turning up is not important. Like, freeing myself and like, you know, is not, and transcending is not important. Sitting down and kind of being here and like meditating with the vibration is important. So literally I just sat down in the club with my hands placed on this countertop and was like, okay, I feel commanded. And I offered that to this image because of the design of it. So this is an image of a person in recline, but it's taken from a different angle that makes it maybe look like a couch or like a discarded object of some sort. But then they also have these Dolce & Gabbana glasses on and these stars in the background, and that kind of mimics like a club environment. Like, these are things that you might wear to that space. So that's 2. And then 3, just like I understand the images as material, I also understand the titles as material. So at some point, my goal, and don't hold me to this, my goal in 10 to 15 years is to make a play. But I want to make a play out of images only. And the titles are kind of helpful in being able to craft what that image might look like. So the titles almost serve the purpose of like conjuring another photograph or another instance that can then sit alongside the photograph that you're actually experiencing.
I love that Elliott has a 10-year plan. I'm still on the 3 to 5 and haven't gotten it. I think we have time for one more question if there is one. Otherwise we can mix and mingle. Elliott, I'm so proud